Thank you for joining me for this online thesis defense. My thesis is entitled Historical Thinking Through Historical Doing, the Impact of Wearing Armor on Visitor Thinking in Arms and Armor Galleries. My committee is composed of Dr. Jessica Luke, the director of the University of Washington's Museology graduate program, Dr. Katie Hedrick-Taylor, an assistant professor in the University of Washington's College of Education, and Seth Margolis, the director of the William A. Helsel Education Department at the Museum of Flight. So, what is this thesis about? Art museums are letting people come in and touch and wear armor. Now, this is being done on a case-by-case basis. Some museums are doing sort of touch tables with facilitators standing by to help people into armor to try at their leisure. Others are doing this as part of demonstrations or in specific contexts. And art museums are doing these things for different purposes. Sometimes it is explicitly educational. Other times we are seeing art museums trying to engage the public and invite them in by doing something novel and fun. The two are sometimes linked, but these are being done for different purposes. That said, we see other museums doing similar things. We see cultural and historical museums and living history sites inviting people to come and handle objects, wear historical clothing and equipment, to adopt an historical persona, to live as an historical person for a brief time to better understand it and for an educational purpose. So, what do people seem to be getting out of their experiences wearing armor in art museums? Well, there is no literature on the subject, at least not directly. So I set out to make some. That is the purpose of this study. That said, there is some literature that points the way to what we might expect to see, some sort of literary shadow in our cave. First, there is embodied learning theory, this being the idea that getting the body involved with learning through physicality, touch, tactility, this helps people learn. Now, we see this most simply when people handle an object. They get a better understanding for how that object moves. When they mimic an object's motion with their own body, they have shown the ability to better understand diagrams of such an object. That said, it is useful outside of just understanding mechanical objects. We see that students in classroom settings, when asked to act out tableaus of stories they have read, exhibit greater reading comprehension, and students who have acted out scientific principles in their science classes have greater reading comprehension and information retention. Now, interactivity, it is unsurprising that people learn better by participating than simply being passive while they are lectured at. So we find that in classroom settings, students learn better when they are taking part, doing some sort of activity, an experiment, or some kind of demonstration they can take part in. In museums, especially historical museums, we see that people can engage by handling historical objects, interacting with first-person interpreters portraying historical people, and even living a simulated historical experience, being an historical person for a brief amount of time. We see that this lets people internalize the history because now they remember it. It is part of them, at least this curated simulation of it. Now, this brings us to historical thinking, the idea that one can think about history in a critical fashion, thinking like an historian. There are different approaches to historical thinking. Sometimes we see in classrooms, in the field, in museums. But for this study, I used Peter Sykes' historical thinking concepts, which were originally pioneered for a classroom setting. Peter Sykes has proposed 6 historical thinking concepts. Historical significance, understanding why a specific historical object, person, event, place is important to history more broadly. Primary source evidence, using what one knows about the context of an historical document or source to draw further conclusions from it. Continuity and change, understanding how historical developments, changes, and events affected the human experience over time, how we differ from and relate to the past. Cause and consequence, understanding how one's context and one's historical values and motivations informed historical people, and how those actions by these historical people further informed their context and further actions down the road. We see historical perspective taking, that being using what one knows about history to take on the mindset and perspective of an historical person to get into their headspace and further understand their world and why they acted the way they did, why they did what they did. And of course the ethical dimension, as being what do we owe history, how ought we to remember history, to memorialize it, to redress past wrongs, etc. Now, this study only assessed the first 5 historical thinking concepts, leaving ethical dimensions for another time. So what are the questions, the research questions of this study? First and most simply, what interests art museum visitors about armor? They're going in, they're seeing armor, what are they taking from the experience? What effect do art museum visitors say wearing armor has on their thinking in an Arms and Armor gallery? So, they go in, they're wearing armor, how do visitors feel they have been impacted by this experience? How does trying on armor impact art museum visitors' historical thinking in Arms and Armor galleries? Do they learn anything about history? Do they think about history critically from doing this activity? If so, how? We shall find out. Now, the methodology was straightforward enough. It's a survey study with semi-structured interviews. I stood near an Arms and Armor gallery asking people if they would like to take part in the study. It was explained to them that the study would entail putting on armor for a moment or two, taking the armor off, going on through the gallery at their leisure, and returning for a brief interview with me, about 10 minutes or less. Excuse me. So, the sample. The sample was collected at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, on February 29th and March 1st, so a Saturday and a Sunday. I spoke to 20 participants, 14 men and 6 women, between 22 and 49 years of age, with a median age of 26. So, what do these data tell us? Well, what interests art museum visitors about armor? There is no one narrative or impression that they take away. Now, 6 of the 20 participants reported that they were most interested in the diversity of the armor on display, the sort of differences of style, of region, of decoration, etc. That said, another 5 said they were interested in the size and weight of the armor. 4 were more interested in the ornamentation, the gilding and the etching, etc. 3 had a personal connection to the armor, 1 pointing out that they liked to look at the armor and imagine themselves in it to create that personal connection for themselves. Another person reporting that they had fond memories of reading stories to their children about knights in shining armor, and so they had some fond nostalgia going into the Arms and Armor gallery. And 1 person reporting that they were already very interested in Arms and Armor, and so seeing some armor in person was very interesting to them. And 2 participants were very interested in the engineering of armor, that being how it was constructed, how it moved, etc. Now, what effect do art museum visitors say wearing armor has on their thinking in an Arms and Armor gallery? Well, 12 reported a better physical understanding of the armor as an object, so how it moved, how much it weighed, how it felt to wear, how it fit, etc. A further 6 spoke about having a better understanding of the historical experience of wearing armor, but this too was grounded in their understanding of the armor as an object, what it would have been like to wear it based now on what they know about that. And then 1 reported that a newfound personal connection with armor, stating that before they had not been terribly interested in armor, but once they had worn some armor themselves, it was a part of their life and their life story. So going into the gallery, they were now much more interested in learning about the armor there. 1 participant reported that they did not feel that trying on armor had any sort of effect on them, but this participant reported also that they were already very interested in armor. This comports with what we see in the literature, in which students who are already well-versed in material gain less from interactives than students who are not nearly as familiar with the material. So, how does trying on armor impact art museum visitors' historical thinking in Arms and Armor galleries? Now, when discussing armor, or the wearing of armor rather, the historical thinking concept that most manifested was historical perspective taking. Now, in Sykes' case, he was talking about people using what they know about history to understand the headspace of people in the past, and using this to get into their mindset. For our purposes, because we are not dealing with classroom learning day in, day out, but rather just with people trying on armor for a moment, and then spending 30 minutes or so in an Arms and Armor gallery, any attempt to understand people in the past and what their experience would be like, we see this as historical perspective taking, at least in a nascent state. So these people were trying to understand what it would be like to be a historical person wearing the armor based on their experience. They had feelings about it, they had experiences of it, they projected these into the past and expected some sort of historical empathy with their past counterparts, rather. Now, sometimes cited while wearing armor, or manifesting during discussion, as primary source evidence, people could draw on their experience wearing armor to make further conclusions about how the armor was used, how it would function, etc. This was distinguished from historical perspective taking because it was less about understanding the mindset and experience of people in the past, so much as understanding how the armor worked and using that to draw further conclusions about how it might be used. Now, cause and consequence, we saw some people citing this, or manifesting this, in that they had a better understanding of how the armor moved, how it felt, and they saw this manifesting in the way that the armor in the gallery was designed, seeing it was heavy, so over time you would remove portions of the armor, it moved this, that, or the other way, and so they could see why there were certain gaps. They saw cloth inside the armor, which they saw as padding it because they felt that the armor was uncomfortable. Now, if some pointed to continuity and change, juxtaposing historical armor, such as they had worn in the activity and seen in the gallery, with contemporary armor, so Kevlar vests and bulletproof vests. Now, these all juxtaposed, sometimes favorably, sometimes unfavorably. Sometimes they were pointing out, oh, the older armor was much more ornate than our modern armor. Others pointing out, our modern armor is better against firearms than old armor, and that is why we use it. But in all cases, they were drawing a link between the past and the present, and comparing and contrasting the two. Sometimes manifesting was historical significance when discussing wearing armor. This most often was when people had worn the armor themselves. They looked at the armor in the gallery and wondered who it could represent. They stated that they had worn the armor, so could the armor in the gallery be exemplary of a person like them, someone of their age, their size, their gender, etc. So, before we go into conclusions, let us speak briefly about limitations. This is a relatively small sample set. We can draw some conclusions, but more data is always valuable. These were all able-bodied adults taking part in this study. It is quite possible that children or adults with mobility limitations may have similar experiences or perhaps different experiences. We will not know until we test. All these people were already visiting an art museum and were willing to go into an arms and armor gallery. Now, demographic data shows us that people going to art museums do tend to be a little bit more often white and a little bit wealthier than the general population. That said, in addition to that, we also see that these are people who are already interested in engaging with subject matter in an art museum. It is possible that someone who simply does not wish to go to an art museum or never has been to an art museum may have different experiences. This is also armor-specific. It is quite possible that these conclusions, this data, can be applied to other sorts of historical interactions, role-plays, and simulated experiences. That said, we can only say for certain that it applies to the experience of wearing armor in an arms and armor gallery in an art museum. So what? What does all this mean for practice? Well, for research implications, the first and foremost implication would be to do it again but bigger. Go to more museums, get more participants. Sometime when we are not in the midst of a global pandemic, it would be valuable to replicate this study, but with a larger sample set over more museums to try to isolate what really is going on and control for any sort of bias or flukes in any given sample set on any given weekend. Do it in different settings. The study was carried out in an art museum. Could perhaps people think differently in a history museum, in an encyclopedic museum, in a living history site? We will not know until we test. And also potentially an inversion. People were placed in armor and asked to think about that armor in relation to the armor they saw in the gallery. Think about history. So essentially they were presented an historical solution and began thinking about what sort of contexts and problems would inform that solution. Now, what if people were given information about an historical context, the sorts of problems and concerns informing the creation of armor in that context, and sent in through a gallery to look at the armor in the gallery and see how they understand this manifesting in the armor they view. It would be interesting to find out what their conclusions are in that, and to see how they compare. Now, practical implications. Now, if one is putting armor in a gallery, one, as we have seen, will get varying impressions from varying people. If all one wants to do is show people some armor and let them draw their own conclusions, then this is well enough. However, if you have a specific impression you want people to take from your armor, if you want them to come away with a specific narrative, to learn a specific thing, you will have to supplement the armor in your gallery with strong interpretive materials to help guide your visitors to those conclusions. Armor on its own, so trying armor, wearing armor, This will help people understand its motion. It helps to illustrate the motion and mobility of armor. Now, this can be a strong complement to armor behind a glass case. So often looks imposing and immobile to the modern viewer. Understanding how it moves better can help them gain a deeper understanding and appreciation for the armor that they are viewing in the museum. That said, we see that they are starting to develop historical perspective taking. And so if you want to make hay with that, you may want to have docents and facilitators on hand to help simulate the historical experience, create a fuller historical context, and guide people to give them some more tools to work with, more of that information, more of that context, so that they can enter a virtuous cycle of historical thinking and come to further conclusions and really get the most out of their experience. And also, this is potentially applicable to any museum with historical subject matter. It does not need to be armor. It is likely that we would see similar results from handling historical mining equipment, farming and woodworking tools from an 18th century farm, the regalia of a royal court someplace. So any one of these could also result in historical thinking. And so with that, we are concluded. Thank you for attending my defense.